Today we're talking with Professor Rob Ogden, who is Chair of Conservation Science, Director of Edinburgh Conservation Science, and Head of Conservation Genetics at the University of Edinburgh, and Dr. Silvia Perez-Espona, Conservation Science Programme Coordinator at Edinburgh and an expert in conservation genetics, molecular ecology, and evolutionary biology. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thanks for having me.
So today for World Wildlife Day, we're going to go through some questions to find out a little bit more about conservation science at Edinburgh. So first of all, what I'm really curious about is, Rob, could you tell us a bit about the reasoning for celebrating World Wildlife Day and what organisations are involved in and launched this campaign?
Sure. Well, World Wildlife Day is a UN General Assembly level initiative. It started about 8 years ago. And the reason for choosing the date of the 3rd of March was that it was the anniversary of the world signing up to the CITES Convention, which is the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. That was signed back in 1973. And it marks, I guess, an international date when everybody started focusing on biodiversity loss. Since then, a huge number of organisations at an international level have got involved in the conservation movement, and marking this day on an annual basis seems to make a lot of sense because it provides a focus for, I think, mostly organisations not involved on a day-to-day basis in conservation to maybe take the opportunity to reflect on what their role could be and what they can do. And obviously it allows the big UN organisations and other large conservation NGOs to promote a little bit about what they're doing and try and take the rest of the society with them on the conservation journey.
And so each year has a theme. And the theme for this year is Forest and Livelihood, Sustaining the People and Planet. Why do you think this theme was selected?
Well, I think it relates to covering some of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So with this theme, they kind of cover Goal 1, which is aiming at alleviating poverty. Goal 12, which is encouraging responsible consumption and production. Goal 13, that calls for climate action. And Goal 15, that is aiming to conserve life on land. So considering these 4 sustainable goals and potentially also the results of a report published by IPBES, which is an independent intergovernmental body that aims to strengthen the science and policy interface for the conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services, this report highlighted that although the decrease of deforestation it has a slowdown at the global level, there are still many areas around the world where deforestation is increasing. And an example would be the loss of forests, of primary and secondary forests in tropical biodiversity-rich areas, where they reported a decrease of 32 million hectares between the year 2010 and 2015.
So there are a lot of projects currently underway within your team and within the wider school. Which ones are you currently involved in that you think fit with the theme of this World Wildlife Day?
So, yeah, as you say, we have a lot of projects ongoing in many different corners of the world. But I think in terms of relationships to forests and forest governance and conservation, probably the projects closer to home are the ones that are most relevant. So, for example, we have quite a big program at the moment looking at red squirrel conservation science. So we have within our group a number of wildlife vets who are looking at the transmission of disease in red squirrels within their forest habitat and the impact of grey squirrels that are gradually moving into Scotland and displacing the reds. And this is quite often a habitat-based, vegetation-based kind of issue. So we know that grey squirrels tend to outcompete reds in deciduous woodlands, and reds have an advantage in evergreen forests. And so the Scottish forest landscape and how we manage that forest landscape has a really big impact on its biodiversity, and in particular on red squirrels as a really good example. So alongside looking at the health of those squirrels, one part of our team is also looking at the genetic diversity of red squirrels in Scotland. We have a number of forestry strongholds, designated red squirrel strongholds across Scotland. And what we want to do is understand whether the squirrels that live in those strongholds are representing the genetic diversity that we have in Scotland and the different populations, the population structure. So we're trying to create maps of genetic diversity and squirrel health and layer them on top of our forestry management strategies so that we can make sure that when we're managing the forests and protecting different areas of woodland, we're also including the conservation management of red squirrels.
And Silvia, what projects are you involved in that would be relevant to the day?
The most relevant project I'm involved now is a study assessing the diet of roe deer in two main areas in Scotland, the Cairngorms and the Trossachs. I'm supervising a great PhD student, Chris Hertz, that is funded by the NERC E4 DTP scheme, the British Deer Society, and Forest Research. And we are collaborating with many stakeholders in the two study areas, including the Woodland Trust, Cairngorms Connect, and Forestry and Land Scotland. And the aim of the project is to use genomic approaches to study the diet of roe deer across seasons, as well as trying to assess any changes in the gut microbiome depending on the diet. Furthermore, we are also going to use proteomics to study some proteins that are secreted in the saliva. These proteins are associated with the detoxification of secondary metabolites from plants. And what we want to see is if there is any differences in the secretion of these proteins depending on the plants ingested. And currently, I'm discussing potential other projects on deer browsing with some of the stakeholders.
It sounds like really rewarding work.
Really happy. Yes.
What inspired you both to get into wildlife conservation?
Well, for me, I think growing up in the 80s, child of Edinburgh and all that, I mean, I think I had natural history in my blood from a long time ago. And I did, my PhD was in looking at speciation process, looking at evolution in natural systems. And it was absolutely fascinating, but also quite abstract. And this was at a time when I was becoming increasingly aware that we were losing species faster than we could study them. And so when I finished my PhD, I thought, well, I need to probably take a more applied route in terms of how I use the scientific skills that I'd learned. And so taking a genetic toolbox and applying it to conservation seemed like the best way forward. And that's basically what I've been doing for the last 20 years or so.
And Silvia?
For me, it was an initial interest on genetics. I was really lucky during my high school. I was able to select like an elective that was on population genetics. So I learned a lot and some reading on genetics during my high school. And then going into university with thinking I would probably take a path more related to genetics. I discovered ecology. And I really, I really enjoy the ecology and how to study ecological processes. So I combine my interest in genetics and ecology. I discovered that there was this discipline, molecular ecology and conservation genetics, where you could integrate both. So for me, that was what started to me be interested. And then in terms of conservation genetics is also the application of the disciplines into solve practical problems in conservation.
That's great. So you're both involved as director and coordinator in the Edinburgh Conservation Science Consortium. What is the remit of ECOS?
So ECOS is really designed to try and help promote the integration of research by public funded bodies, so mainly universities, but other types of research institute as well, and promote the integration of what they produce into conservation policy and practice. We find often in conservation realm that there's a bit of a disconnect between the academic scientific communities and those that need to actually use that science. And so ECOS began 3 years ago now, and it includes as sort of core members, members from this university, University of Edinburgh, University of Heriot-Watt, the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, Nature Scotland, National Museum Scotland, and then a lot of stakeholder partners who are interested in different aspects of how science can help their day-to-day work to either promote management of species in the field or to try and inform the development of new conservation policies in Scotland.
And so one of the recent activities of ECOS was the organisation of the webinar related to this year's World Wildlife Day theme, Shaping Scotland's Future Treescape. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, the webinar took place on the 3rd of February, and we had a great interest for it with over 130 attendees. This webinar was chaired by David Edwards, which is a program manager at Forest Research, and we had 5 great talks that were related to the topic, from discussing tree planting for carbon sequestration, discussing the importance of ecological monitoring when you are planning reforestation, the importance of considering the social aspects for woodland expansion, as well as a thought-provoking presentation on the commercial drivers for reforestation. And we ended the presentations also with a presentation on urban tree planting. So after the talks, we had a really fruitful discussion with the attendees. And if anyone is interested, the webinar was recorded and is available in Media Hopper.
Great, so we can share a link to that as well.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. You made me think then for a minute when you were talking about the webinar. I know that a part of the role that you occupy within ECOS, but also in both of your roles more widely, is to work to impact policy as well as to make strides in science. What changes would you like to see in policy in regard to wildlife conservation?
I think national policy, when it comes to wildlife issues and wildlife conservation, is a gradually evolving project, and I think we're not looking for particular changes to happen overnight. What we're trying to increasingly do is make sure that governments recognise the importance of wildlife conservation, not just for the sake of wildlife itself, but at an ecosystem level, and in terms of the societal benefits of taking care of our natural world. And I think by gradually translating the research that we're doing, which is increasingly telling us this message, and making sure that that information is available to policymakers in the right format, that's going to gradually nudge policy in the right direction. We find this is happening in Scotland. We find it's happening in the UK, and more broadly, there's an increasing awareness in the rest of the world. But getting it, I guess, if we were to change one thing, it would be to try and raise the status of wildlife ecosystem conservation in the minds of policymakers, so that they really do understand this is not a nice to have, but an essential part of any government policy. If we don't get this right, we're going to be paying for it in the medium and long term, and it's going to be a lot easier to fix now.
Yeah. And that links in, I guess, to the theme of the webinar. You're talking broadly about getting science into biodiversity management and policy. So why focus on this area rather than on the research itself? You may have partly answered that question already.
Yeah, well, I think researchers are very good at conducting the research, getting scientific publications out in the scientific literature, and that to a large extent is their remit, and that's their end goal for a lot of academics, certainly. But I think it's fair to say that most policymakers don't read scientific papers. Even though they're available, it doesn't sort of fit into their day-to-day life. So we really want to focus with this webinar and in most of the activities of ECOS on trying to bridge that gap really between the research outputs of the scientists and the policy briefs that can be generated for governments to read and to act upon. So we think there's a lot of people doing a good job on research. We think there is a gap at the moment in the translation of that research into bite-sized policy chunks, which is, I guess, the purpose of ECOS to some extent.
Yeah. Okay. And Silvia, this year's World Wildlife Day also highlights the importance of forests, forest species, and ecosystem services in sustaining the livelihoods of people. How important is it to take into consideration local communities for the success of biodiversity conservation?
Yeah, I think it is crucial to involve local communities in conservation projects, not only when the conservation projects or actions are being planned, but I think local communities should be involved at all stages of conservation. This is because local communities not only have a great knowledge on the areas, but also often they depend on nature for their livelihood. So I think there's for the benefits of the conservation project to be successful, plus the morality that you need to include local communities, I think it is really important. And I think we are seeing conservation, it really involves more local communities now. I think even also in research, I think that we can make greater efforts to involve local communities in our research. Not only thinking locally, but also thinking when we work abroad, it is really important that we create these connections, but also that we involve the local communities, including local researchers and practitioners in the research.
What do you both think your next steps are in your conservation research?
Well, I think at a local level within our group at the university, we're increasingly trying to use new technologies to bring us new data and provide new information to answer different questions. So we might be looking at different ways of diagnosing animal health. We may be looking at using genomics to tell us more about populations that we want to conserve. And I think there's also something in there about increasing our interdisciplinarity. So we've already talked about the fact that our group is made up of wildlife vets and wildlife geneticists, but also reaching beyond those two fields and making sure that we're bringing all of the right types of scientific expertise to bear on a single conservation challenge. But ultimately, conservation is really about the people involved. So a lot of this is to do with communication, certainly among scientists initially.
Yeah, for me, I agree with what Rob said. For me, it's also the increasing the effort to probably work more with social scientists and trying to involve or collaborate more from the beginning with stakeholders, including local communities, to make sure that the research that we are producing it's relevant and it's helping solving some of the conservation problems.
Yeah, fantastic. And what we'll do is we'll put some links to some of these things in the description for the video so that people can take a look. Well, thank you both very much for joining us on World Wildlife Day. It was a pleasure to speak to you. So thank you very much, Rob, and thank you very much, Silvia.
Thanks.
Thank you, Hannah.